Good evening and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Tonight we begin with a story of Arctic life, medieval Greenland, years of ice, sheep and stone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Medieval Greenland, years of ice, sheep and stone. The basalt respiration, the architecture of the turf house. To understand the survival of the Norse in Greenland, settled by Eric the Red in the late 10th century, one must first discard the American concept of a house as a structure that stands upon the land. In the eastern and western settlements, a house was a structure that was of the land. It was a mineral and biological bastion. This first movement, the basalt respiration, explores the boring history of thermal compression. It is a study in how the Norse used the very skin of the earth to create a static pocket of warmth against the infinite loom of the Arctic gale. The cutting of the sward, the rhythm of the fibrous slabs. The construction of a Greenlandic longhouse began with the rhythmic excavation of the turf. The atmosphere was one of damp, root-heavy toil. The air smelled of frozen peat, crushed heather, and cold clay. Because timber was a luxury of the driftwood, the Norse built with what the Americans might call Arctic bricks, thick rectangular slabs of topsoil held together by a rhythmic network of roots. The sound was the rhythm of the slicing spade. The worker would push the iron-edged spade into the permafrost with a rhythmic crunch and lever. Crunch, heave, thud. This was the percussion of the foundation. Each slab of turf was a rhythmic unit of insulation. The herringbone laying was the history of the structural weave. The turf was not just stacked, it was rhythmically interlocked in a diagonal pattern to prevent the granite seepage of water. As the wall grew to be 4 or even 6 feet thick, the infinite loom was weaving a fabric of earth. To the builder, the day was a repetitive motion of lift and pack, a rhythmic pat and press that turned the fragile grass into a solid barrier against the mineral void of the north. The basalt core, the rhythm of the frictional alignment. Within the thick turf walls, the Norse often placed a skeletal frame of basalt boulders. This was the stone heart of the respiration. The atmosphere was one of crushing weight. The sound was the rhythm of the grind and seat. Because they had no mortar or lime, the stones had to be rhythmically rocked until they found their natural equilibrium. The sound was a low-frequency grumble, grind, clunk. This was the sound of the gravity seal. The leveling shard was the history of the micro-adjustment. A builder would take a small, flat piece of stone and rhythmically tap it into the gap to stop the larger boulder from wobbling. This rhythmic tink-tink-ting was the metronome of the masonry. It was a static persistence. The result was a wall that did not stand so much as it leaned into the earth, a rhythmic respiration of pressure that allowed the house to settle into the permafrost without cracking. The muffled interior, the rhythm of the acoustic compression. Once inside the completed longhouse, the basalt respiration changed from a labor to an atmosphere. The primary quality of a turf house was its density of silence. The atmosphere was one of saturated stillness. The sound was the rhythm of the muffled exterior. 100-mile-per-hour gale could be screaming across the fjord, but inside the 4-foot turf walls, it was reduced to a faint, ghostly whimper. This was the boring history of decibel absorption. The infinite loom of the turf, the millions of tiny air pockets trapped in the roots, swallowed the sound. The only internal sound was the rhythmic sigh of the inhabitants. Because the air was heavy and humid, warmed by the measured hearth and the sheepfold's breath, every movement was sonically dampened. A footstep on the floor of packed earth and twigs produced a rhythmic crush and thud that died instantly. For the American reader, imagine living inside a living mountain. The house was not a box, it was a rhythmic filter that separated the chaos of the sky from the stasis of the soul. The roof's drift, the rhythm of the snow weight. The respiration reached its peak in the deep winter when the house underwent its final thermal transformation. The atmosphere was one of subterranean enclosure. As the snow began to fall, it would collect on the sloping turf roof, adding a rhythmic layer of white insulation over the layer of green. The boring history of the snow load was the history of the structural compression. The sound was the rhythmic groan of the driftwood rafters as they accepted the weight. Creak, settle. The house was rhythmically breathed into the landscape until it was invisible. From the outside, there were no walls, only mounds of white. Inside, the infinite loom of the snow created a perfect thermal seal. The rhythmic hiss of the blizzard above was a distant memory. The inhabitant lived in a rhythmic warmth that was recycled and thick, a boring history of carbon dioxide stasis, where the only change was the slow rhythmic drip of condensation from the ridgepole. The spring thaw, the rhythm of the weeping earth. The cycle of the basalt respiration concluded with the rhythmic awakening of the spring. The atmosphere was one of damp release. As the sun returned to the fjord, the frozen core of the turf walls would begin to rhythmically soften. The sound was the rhythm of the internal trickle. Water would move through the root channels of the turf and drip into the drainage gutters along the interior walls. Drip, plink, slide. This was the sound of the house melting. The boring history of the turf patch was the history of the annual repair. Every spring, the Norse would rhythmically replace the slabs that had washed away or collapsed. This was a rhythmic marriage with the land. The infinite loom of the house was re-woven with fresh green grass. The respiration never truly ended, it only shifted from the static cold of the stone to the fluid life of the sward, ensuring that the medieval stasis of Greenland remained rhythmically protected within its earth-bound shell. The measured loom, the rhythmic weaving of the wadmal. If the basalt respiration provided the Greenlanders with their external shell, the measured loom provided their internal skin. In the medieval North Atlantic, survival was a perpetual fibrous calculation. To inhabit Greenland was to be perpetually entangled in the rhythmic interlacing of wool. This was the era of wadmal, a movement defined by the perpetual motion of the warp-weighted loom. For the American reader, accustomed to the instantaneous fast fashion of the modern world, the production of wadmal represents the extreme longevity of labor, a study in the lanolin scent of the fleece and the rhythmic clack of the stone, the shearing of the fold, the rhythm of the coarse harvest. The life of the garment began in the atmospheric dampness of the spring shearing. The Norse Greenlandic sheep, a hardy, short-tailed breed, produced a dual-coated fleece, a soft underwool, and a long, hair-like outer coat. The atmosphere was one of greasy vitality. The air smelled of wet wool, animal heat, and the salt spray of the nearby fjord. The sound was the rhythm of the plucking and snip. Often the wool was not shorn with shears, but rude, rhythmically pulled by hand as the sheep naturally molted. The sound was a rhythmic tug and rustle. Tug, pull, sigh. This was the extraction of the fiber. The boring history of the fleece sorting was the history of the twofold reality. The inhabitants would rhythmically separate the fine from the coarse, creating piles of wool that would define the rhythm of the winter. To the Greenlander, this was a rhythmic inventory of warmth. Every handful of wool was a unit of survival. The infinite loom began here in the manual sorting of the biological gift, a process of rhythmic repetition that prepared the fiber for its geometric transformation. The spindle's whirl, the rhythm of the gravitational twist. Before the loom could sing, the wool had to be spun. This was the most constant rhythm of Greenlandic life. A woman never sat idle. Her hands were in a state of perpetual rotation. The atmosphere was one of suspended torque. The sound was the rhythm of the whirring stone. Using a soapstone spindle whirl, a small heavy disc carved from the local rock, the spinner would rhythmically twist and drop the fiber. The sound was a rhythmic hum and snap. Hum, the rotation; snap, the drawing of the thread. This was the sonic pulse of the longhouse. The boring history of the torsion was the history of the strength of the spiral. By rhythmically winding the thread onto the wooden shaft, the spinner was storing energy. The spindle whirl acted as a flywheel of time. For the American reader, imagine a world where every inch of thread was a rhythmic act of the body. The infinite loom was being primed through millions of rhythmic revolutions, a boring history of rotational endurance that lasted from the first frost to the last ice melt. The warp-weighted stand, the rhythm of the tensioned stone. The upright loom, the vefstad, stood against the turf wall, a harp of fiber. It was a frame of driftwood from which the warp threads hung, kept taut by rhythmic stones. The atmosphere was one of vertical gravity. The sound was the master rhythm of the winter, the clack and thump. The weaver would stand before the loom, moving rhythmically back and forth. The sound was a rhythmic clack, clack, swoosh, thud. Clack, clack, the stone weights hitting each other as the heddle rod shifted the threads. Swoosh, the bone needle carrying the weft. And thud, the wooden batten beating the thread upward. The heddle shift was the history of the geometric opening. By rhythmically leaning the rod, the weaver created the shed, the gap through which the thread passed. This was the percussion of the textile. The stones, carved from the basalt and granite of the fjord, provided the rhythmic tension necessary to weave a cloth so dense it could deflect the rain. The infinite loom was literally anchored to the earth by these stones, its rhythmic clatter a mechanical lullaby for the household. The wadlol bolt, the rhythm of the slow accretion. Wadmol was not just cloth, it was currency. In a land without silver or gold, the rhythm of the loom produced the value of the settlement. The atmosphere was one of metric toil. The sound was the rhythm of the measured length. After weeks of weaving, the cloth would grow by inches and ells. The sound was the rhythmic roll and fold as the finished wadmal was taken off the loom. Rustle, fold, thud. This was the boring history of standardized surface. Every piece of clothing, every sail for the skin boats, and every legal payment was a rhythmic accumulation of weaving. To the Greenlander, a bolt of wadmal was a block of time. It represented 3,000 rhythmic clacks of the stone and 10,000 rhythmic whirls of the spindle. The infinite loom turned the fragility of the sheep into the permanence of the economy. A rhythmic transformation that allowed the Norse to trade with the world from the edge of the void. The needle's path, the rhythm of the final seal. The cycle of the measured loom concluded with the rhythmic stitching of the garments.
the atmosphere was one of fibrous closure. The sound was the rhythm of the puncture and pull. Using a needle made of seal bone or walrus ivory, the inhabitant would rhythmically bind the wadmal to the body. The sound was a rhythmic tug and sigh. Scrape the bone through the wool, tug the thread tightening. This was the final respiration of the loom. The overstitch was the history of the wind-proof seam. By rhythmically double-lapping the cloth, the Greenlander created a thermal barrier that was acoustically still. The inhabitant, dressed in this rhythmic shield, could now face the glacial advance of the winter. The infinite loom had finished its weave, leaving the static warmth of the wool to guard the rhythmic silence of the soul. As the measured hearth burned low, the only sound was the rhythmic rustle of the wadmal as the family huddled together, safe within the fibrous history of their own making. The seal bone metronome, the rhythmic carving of the everyday. If the measured loom was the castle's internal skin, the seal bone metronome was its functional skeleton. In the medieval Norse settlements of Greenland, iron was a precious, dwindling resource, often salvaged from the wreckage of rare ships or traded at exorbitant costs. To inhabit this landscape was to witness the rhythmic transformation of the biological into the mechanical. This was the era of osteological substitution, a movement defined by the rhythmic scrape of the sandstone against bone. For the American reader, the seal bone tool represents the ultimate economy of the carcass, a study in the acrid scent of bone dust and the rhythmic vibration of the file. The extraction of the raw, the rhythm of the skeletal sort. The creation of a tool began with the atmospheric cold of the butchery. After the seal hunt, the focus shifted from meat to the mineral potential of the frame. The atmosphere was one of viscous industry. The air smelled of iron-rich blood, salt, and the damp earth where the carcasses were laid. The sound was the rhythm of the clean scrape. The Norse would use a small, precious iron knife to rhythmically strip the marrow and sinew from the dense leg bones of the harp seal or the heavy ribs of the walrus. The sound was a rhythmic shh, tink. Shh, the blade on the bone. Tink, the blade hitting the stone floor. This was the preparation of the blank. The bone bleaching was the history of the natural curing. The bones were laid out in the sun and frost to drain the oils and harden the calcium. To the Greenlander, this was a rhythmic inventory of hardness. Every rib bone was a potential needle, every jawbone a potential sled runner. The infinite loom began here in the manual selection of the skeletal architecture, a process of rhythmic weighting that turned the soft flesh into a geological tool. The sandstone grind, the rhythm of the microscopic erosion. Once cured, the bone had to be shaped. Without saws or drills of high-carbon steel, the Greenlander relied on frictional geometry. The atmosphere was one of powdery calcification. The air was thick with a fine white dust that tasted of ancient sea salt.
The sound was the master rhythm of the workshop, the scrape. The carver would take a piece of local sandstone and rhythmically rub the bone into a point or an edge. The sound was a rhythmic scritch, 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 pause. The pause was for the carver to rhythmically blow away the dust, puff. The bevel was the history of the slow angle. By rhythmically varying the pressure, the carver created a razor-sharp needle or a heavy-duty awl. This was the percussion of the particle. Every 1,000 scrapes represented a millimeter of progress.
The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of utility out of the skeletal archive. To the American reader, imagine a world where the click of a plastic tool is replaced by the rhythmic sigh of stone eating bone, a boring history of mineral on animal friction that lasted through the long twilight of the winter months. The drill's torque, the rhythm of the reciprocal twist. To join bone to wood or leather, holes were required. This was the rhythm of the bow drill. The atmosphere was one of frictional heat. The sound was the rhythmic hum and whir. A wooden bow strung with seal-hide cord was rhythmically moved back and forth to spin a bone-tipped spindle. The sound was a rhythmic vrr, 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 vrr. The forward stroke, vrr, the return. This was the sound of the entry. The point heat was the history of the scorched socket. As the bone tip rhythmically burrowed into the material, it would create a rhythmic squeak and a tiny wisp of smoke. The carver's hand moved in a constant rhythmic sawing motion, his eyes fixed on the geometry of the center. The infinite loom was piercing the matter, turning the static bone into a dynamic component of a loom, a harpoon, or a door latch. The tallow polish, the rhythm of the luminous surface. A tool was not finished until it was sealed. This was the rhythm of the fat rub. The atmosphere was one of greasy perfection. The sound was the rhythm of the soft squeal. The carver would take a rag dipped in seal tallow and rhythmically buff the bone until it shone like ivory. The sound was a rhythmic squeak and slide. Squeak, slide, squeak. This was the boring history of pore sealing. By rhythmically driving the fat into the bone's grain, the carver ensured it would not splinter in the dry Arctic air. The result was a tool that felt organic and warm in the hand. The infinite loom turned the waste of the hunt into the grace of the household. A bone needle was not just an object, it was a rhythmic unit of labor that had been polished by 1,000 circles of the hand. The tool's resonance, the rhythm of the final click. The cycle of the seal bone metronome concluded with the rhythmic utility of the day. The atmosphere was one of mechanical reliability. The sound was the rhythmic bone-on-wood clack. When the bone needle hit the wooden loom frame or the bone toggle snapped into the leather harness, it produced a high-frequency percussion. Click, clack, snap. This was the final respiration of the bone. The wear mark was the history of the second life. Over years of use, the bone would rhythmically conform to the user's grip, becoming a biomechanical extension of the arm. The inhabitant, working by the soapstone hearth, felt the rhythmic density of the bone, a biological promise that the material stasis of Greenland would hold. The infinite loom had finished its weave, leaving the static strength of the skeleton to guard the rhythmic work of the settlement. As the measured loom clattered in the background, the only sound was the rhythmic scratch of the bone as it worked the wadmal, a sound of life continuing through the mineral remains of the sea. The hayfield vigil, the rhythmic harvest of the Arctic summer. If the seal bone metronome provided the tools for the dark, the hayfield vigil was the castle's caloric pulse during the light. In the medieval Norse settlements of Greenland, summer was not a season of leisure, it was a rhythmic sprint against the frost. To inhabit the eastern settlement was to be a slave to the rhythmic growth of the stunted grass. This was the era of caloric scarcity, a movement defined by the rhythmic swish of the scythe. For the American reader, the Greenlandic harvest represents the absolute fragility of the food chain, a study in the scent of sun-dried clover and the rhythmic thud of the turf sled. The scythe's horizon, the rhythm of the symmetric sweep. The harvest began in the atmospheric clarity of the late July sun. Because the growing season was so short, every blade of grass was a unit of winter survival. The atmosphere was one of panic-induced precision. The air smelled of sweet vernal grass, cold sea air, and dusty pollen. The sound was the rhythmic, continuous shear. The mower would move through the tune, the manured home field, with a rhythmic swish and step. Swish, the short iron-edged blade cutting through the stems. Step, the advancement into the next arc. This was the percussion of the meadow.
The blade angle was the history of the efficiency of the arc. In Greenland, the grass was sparse and short. A mower had to keep the blade rhythmically flat to the earth to catch the nutritious lower stems. Every 10 minutes, the mower would pause for the rhythmic sharpening. The sound was a rhythmic zing, zing, zing as a whetstone was run over the edge. Zing, zing, flip. This was the tuning of the harvest. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of fodder, a process where the rhythmic motion of the arm was the only thing preventing the static death of the livestock in the coming dark. The drying rack, the rhythm of the aerated stack. Once cut, the grass could not be left on the damp ground to rot. It had to be rhythmically elevated. This was the rhythm of the frictional toss. The atmosphere was one of golden dehydration. The sound was the rhythm of the rustling fork. Using wooden forks carved from driftwood, the harvesters would rhythmically flip and shake the hay to catch the wind. The sound was a rhythmic crackle and sigh. Crackle, the drying stems. Sigh, the wind passing through the loose pile. The hay frame was the history of the vertical dry. Because Greenland was humid, the hay was often rhythmically draped over low stone walls or wooden hurdles to keep it off the permafrost. The sound was a rhythmic slap and tuck, the sound of vegetable weight finding its balance. The infinite loom was dewatering the harvest, turning the fluid sap of the summer into the static carbon of the winter, a rhythmic transformation that ensured the hay would not spontaneously combust or mold in the barn. The turf sled's trek, the rhythm of the dragging burden. Transporting the dried hay to the byre, the cow barn, was a mechanical struggle. This was the rhythm of the frictional haul. The atmosphere was one of dusty toil. The sound was the rhythmic creak and crunch. Because there were no carts or wheels in Greenland, due to the geometry of the rocks, the hay was loaded onto stone sleds or skin trays. The sound was a rhythmic grind and slither. Grind, the wood or bone runners on the pebbles. Slither, the runners on the grass. This was the sound of the transport. The hemp tie was the history of the compressed bundle. The hay was rhythmically bound and tightened with seal-hide ropes to prevent the wind from stealing the caloric wealth. The sound was a rhythmic ugh and creak as the harvesters leaned their weight into the knots. The infinite loom was consolidating the energy, turning the scatter of the field into the density of the barn. The barn pack was the rhythm of the horizontal layering. Inside the byre, the hay was rhythmically stored. This was the rhythm of the measured tread. The atmosphere was one of sustained suffocation. The air was thick with chaff and sweet fermentation. The sound was the rhythm of the thud and stamp. As the hay was tossed into the loft, the barn stompers, often children, would rhythmically tread down the piles to squeeze out the air. The sound was a muffled percussion, thump, thump, thump. This was the boring history of storage volume. By rhythmically packing the fodder, the Norse ensured they could fit enough rhythmic units of heat to feed 30 cows through a 7-month winter. The infinite loom was archiving the harvest. The sound of the stomping feet was the final word of the harvest, a rhythmic punctuation that told the family the caloric bastion was ready. The first frost, the rhythm of the seasonal hiss. The cycle of the hayfield vigil concluded with the rhythmic arrival of the cold. The atmosphere was one of sharp, crystalline finality. The sound was the rhythm of the frozen blade. One morning, the harvesters would find the grass rhythmically brittle, covered with a layer of white silt. The sound of a boot on the grass was no longer a swish, but a rhythmic snap and crackle. Snap, crackle, crunch. This was the death of the summer loom. The empty field was the history of the dormant sward. The infinite loom of the harvest was locked. The grass would no longer grow, it would only wait. The inhabitant, looking out over the static grey meadow, felt the rhythmic satisfaction of the full barn, a caloric promise that the biological stasis of the settlement would survive the glacial advance. The only sound was the rhythmic rustle of the dry hay in the byre as the cows began their long winter respiration, a sound of energy consumed to pay for the history of the cold.
The soapstone hearth, the slow pulse of the blubber lamp. If the hayfield vigil was the energy that powered the body, the soapstone hearth was the visual metabolism of the Greenlandic winter. In the eastern and western settlements, light was not a constant, but a rhythmic consumption of liquid fat. To sit within the turf-walled longhouse during the 4-month twilight was to witness the rhythmic survival of the flame. This was the era of the blubber lamp, a movement defined by the slow reciprocity of the wick and the oil. For the American reader, the soapstone hearth represents the biological reality of visibility, a study in the heavy scent of rendered seal and the rhythmic drip of the melting fat. The carving of the basin, the rhythm of the concave void. The light began in the mineral silence of the soapstone quarries near the fjords. Soapstone, or steatite, was the gold of the north, a soft, magnesium-rich rock that could be carved like hardwood. The atmosphere was one of grey, greasy dust. The air smelled of wet powder and the metallic tang of the chisel. The sound was the rhythm of the hollow scoop. A carver would use a pointed stone or a rare iron tool to rhythmically peck and scrape the center of a flat block. The sound was a rhythmic tink and grind. Tink, the impact, grind, the smoothing. This was the creation of the reservoir. The boring history of the thermal mass was the history of the heat-retentive stone. Because soapstone absorbed heat rhythmically, the lamp would stay warm long after the flame died. To the Greenlander, this was a rhythmic guarantee of warmth. The infinite loom began here, in the manual shaping of the stone, a process where the rhythmic stroke of the chisel created a static vessel for the fluid light. The rendering of the seal, the rhythm of the liquid flow. A lamp is only as good as its fuel. In Greenland, that fuel was seal blubber. The atmosphere in the kitchen area was one of oily humidity. The air was thick with the primal scent of the hunt, a heavy, fishy aroma of boiling fat. The sound was the rhythm of the sputtering render. Chunks of blubber were placed in a soapstone pot over the central fire. As the heat broke down the cellular structure, the oil would rhythmically release and bubble. The sound was a rhythmic pop and hiss, pop, sizzle, glug. This was the percussion of the fuel. The boring history of the clarified oil was the history of the pure burn. The inhabitant would rhythmically skim the impurities from the surface with a bone spoon. The sound was a rhythmic slosh and drip. Each drop of clear yellow oil was a rhythmic unit of time. The infinite loom was defleshing the seal, turning the biological mass of the seal into the liquid energy of the hearth, a rhythmic transformation that prepared the household for the long dark. The moss wick vigil, the rhythm of the capillary draw. The action of the lamp occurred at the rhythmic interface of the wick and the oil. In Greenland, wicks were made from dried bog moss or Arctic cotton. The atmosphere was one of golden obscurity. The sound was the master rhythm of the night, the sizzle. The wick was laid along the edge of the soapstone basin, soaking up the oil. The sound was a faint rhythmic crackle and puff as the carbonized moss was consumed. Crackle, puff. This was the respiration of the light. The boring history of the wick trimming was the history of the regulated flame. A woman would sit by the lamp, using a small bone pin to rhythmically nudge the moss to keep the flame from smoking. This was the rhythmic maintenance of sight. Every 10 minutes, the pin would click against the stone. Click, slide. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of vision. To the American reader, imagine a world where light required a constant manual presence, a boring history of flickering vigilance that turned the static room into a pulsing sanctuary. The shadow geometry, the rhythm of the expanding wall. Because the blubber lamp was a low-intensity source, it created a rhythmic distortion of the architecture. The atmosphere was one of elastic darkness. The sound was the rhythm of the fluttering draft. As the basalt respiration of the house moved the air, the flame would rhythmically dance and snap. The shadows of the measured loom and the seal-bone tools on the turf walls would rhythmically grow and shrink. A loom weight would become a rhythmic giant, its shadow swaying in a mechanical lullaby. The boring history of peripheral vision was the history of the shifting boundary. The inhabitants lived in a rhythmic circle of yellow light, beyond which the house was liquid black. The infinite loom of the shadows was rewriting the room every second. The inhabitant, sitting within this pulsing reality, felt the rhythmic security of the flame, a biological pulse that held the mineral void of the Greenlandic night at bay. The final gutter, the rhythm of the acrid fade. The cycle of the soapstone hearth concluded with the rhythmic exhaustion of the fuel. The atmosphere was one of heavy, smoky sleep. The sound was the rhythm of the final sputter. As the oil reached the bottom of the soapstone basin, the flame would turn small and blue, rhythmically lapping at the stone. The sound was a faint, rhythmic hiss and pop, hiss, pop, gone. This was the death of the day's sight. The lingering smoke was the history of the ghostly aftermath. Long after the light was gone, the oily vapor of the seal fat would rhythmically drift and settle into the wadmal clothes and the turf walls. The smell remained, a rhythmic memory of the fire. The inhabitant, now safe in the absolute black of the longhouse, would breathe in this greasy scent as they drifted into sleep. The infinite loom of the lamp had finished its weave, leaving only the rhythmic drip of the warm oil as it solidified in the cooling stone, a sound of energy resting until the rhythm of the morning flint began the cycle of the light once more. The granite parish, the rhythmic stacking of Halsey. If the soapstone hearth was the castle's internal vision, the granite parish was its external proof of permanence.
In the 14th century, at the height of Norse Greenlandic culture, the construction of the church at Wolsey represented the ultimate victory of mineral order over Arctic chaos. To build with stone in a land of shifting ice was to engage in a boring history of frictional precision. This movement explores the rhythmic stacking of the granite, a process defined by the measured impact of the iron and the rock. For the American reader, the Wolsey Church represents the industrial stubbornness of faith, a study in the scent of wet limestone and the rhythmic ponderance of the slab. The quarry's echo, the rhythm of the split and heave. The church began in the atmospheric grey of the granite outcroppings along the fjord. Greenlandic granite is a relentless material, hard, dense, and resistant to the granite respiration of the frost. The atmosphere was one of crystalline resistance. The air smelled of pulverized stone, ozone, and the aqueous scent of the nearby sea. The sound was the rhythm of the iron wedge. Stonemasons would find natural fissures in the rock and rhythmically drive in the wedges with heavy hammers. The sound was a rhythmic chink, chink, crack. Chink, chink, the steel on stone. Crack, the internal fracturing of the granite. This was the extraction of the order. The feather and wedge was the history of incremental force. By rhythmically tapping each wedge in sequence, the mason created a unified pressure that would eventually shear a 10-ton block from the mountain. To the Greenlander, this was a rhythmic negotiation with the earth. The infinite loom began here, in the manual separation of the mass, a process where the rhythmic ring of the metal summoned the static wall from the wild stone. The dry stone marriage, the rhythm of the frictional alignment. Unlike the churches of Europe, Wolsey was built without mortar. It relied on mechanical gravity. The atmosphere was one of substantial finality. The sound was the rhythm of the grind and seat. Each block of granite, some weighing hundreds of pounds, had to be lowered and shifted until its surface met the one below with molecular precision. The sound was a low-frequency grumble, grind, clunk. This was the sound of the gravity seal. The shim stone was the history of the micro-correction. A mason would take a small, sharp fragment of granite and rhythmically tap it into the gap to ensure the massive slab was rhythmically level. This tink, tink, ting was the metronome of the parish. It was frictional equilibrium. The result was a wall so tight that a seal-bone needle could not pass between the stones, a rhythmic respiration of mass that allowed the church to hold its breath for 7 centuries. The lintel's ascent, the rhythm of the vertical drag. The most difficult rhythm was the raising of the great lintels over the doors and windows. The atmosphere was one of strained gravity. The sound was the rhythmic creak and heave. Using rhythmic chants and hemp ropes, the community would pull the massive horizontal stones up wooden ramps. The sound was a rhythmic and squeal. The collective breath. Squeal, the wood under the granite. This was the rhythm of the elevation.
The friction slide was the history of the controlled rise. To prevent the stone from sliding back, workers would rhythmically place wedges behind the rollers. This mechanical punctuation ensured that every rhythmic unit of progress was permanently captured. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of height, turning the horizontal weight of the quarry into the vertical dignity of the nave. To the inhabitant, the rhythmic thud of the lintel finding its seat was the acoustic proof that the great stasis of the church was complete. The bell's respiration, the rhythm of the sonic boundary. Once the granite was stacked, the church required a voice. This was the rhythm of the bell swing. The atmosphere was one of expanding resonance. The sound was the rhythm of the iron on bronze. In the small wooden belfry, the bell would rhythmically sway and strike. The sound was a rhythmic clang and hum. Clang, hum. This was the temporal pulse of the fjord. The sheepfold's breath, the rhythmic muffle of the byre. If the granite parish was the castle's external proof of permanence, the sheepfold's breath was its internal biological engine. In the depth of the Greenlandic winter, when the sun failed to rise above the jagged peaks of the fjords, the survival of the Norse depended on a rhythmic symbiosis between man and beast. To enter the fjoss, that is, a byre, usually a low turf-walled extension of the longhouse, was to witness the rhythmic suspension of life in the dark. This was the era of indoor grazing, a movement defined by the saturated humidity of the huddle. For the American reader, the byre represents the primal intimacy of the harvested warmth, a study in the scent of fermenting manure and the rhythmic muffle of the herd. The descent into the earth, the rhythm of the sub-level entry. The byre was often built slightly lower than the living quarters, allowing the gravity of heat to pool and rise. The atmosphere was one of viscous darkness. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of damp wool, ammonia, and sweet decaying hay. It was a space of biological stasis. The sound was the rhythm of the muffled stumble. A servant entering from the main hall would move with a rhythmic slide and tap. Slide, the foot on the damp earthen floor. Tap, the hand feeling the rough stone wall. This was the navigation of the void. The stall partition was the history of the contained animal. Each cow or sheep was rhythmically slotted between vertical slabs of basalt or driftwood. The sound was a rhythmic thud and scrape as the animals shifted their weight against the stone. Thud, scrape, sigh. This mechanical restriction ensured that the biological heat was concentrated. The infinite loom began here, in the manual placement of the living bodies, a process of rhythmic alignment that turned the scatter of the field into a solid wall of respiration. The ruminant pulse, the rhythm of the eternal chew. Once the animals were settled, the primary activity of the byre was rumination. The atmosphere was one of cyclical digestion. The sound was the master rhythm of the byre, the grind. 20 cows and 50 sheep would rhythmically chew the cud, the dried hay from the hayfield vigil. The sound was a rhythmic crush, crush, slurp. Crush, crush, slurp. This was the percussion of the calorie. The mastication cycle was the history of the secondary extraction. The animals were rhythmically refining the summer into winter heat. To the inhabitant sitting in the adjacent room, this low-frequency vibration was the acoustic proof of survival. It was a rhythmic assurance that the infinite loom of the metabolism was active. The byre was a living furnace, its rhythmic grinding of the stems a mechanical lullaby that promised the great stasis of the livestock would hold until the spring. The drainage canal, the rhythm of the slow seepage. To maintain the biological purity of the byre, the Norse constructed a central stone-lined gutter. This was the rhythm of the slow seepage. The atmosphere was one of saline humidity. The sound was the rhythm of the drip and trickle. The liquid waste from the animals would rhythmically collect and move towards the low end of the byre. The sound was a rhythmic plink, plink, gurgle. Plink, plink, slide. This was the sound of the waste metabolism. The gutter slope was the history of hydraulic sanitation. By rhythmically shoveling the solids into the gutter, the inhabitants ensured that the biological engine did not stall in its own waste. The sound was a rhythmic scrape and squelch as the wooden shovel moved through the stalls. Scrape, squelch, thud. The infinite loom was cleaning the engine, turning the animal residue into future fertilizer, a rhythmic transformation that closed the cycle of the sward.
The steam cloud, the rhythm of the visible breath. Because the byre was so well insulated by the basalt respiration of the turf, the heat of the animals created a microclimate. The atmosphere was one of white obscurity. The sound was the rhythm of the collective exhalation. When a human entered with a lamp, the warm breath of the herd would rhythmically condense into steam. The sound was a rhythmic whoosh and fade. Whoosh, the breath hitting the cold air. Sigh, the animals settling. The infinite loom of the steam was weaving a fabric of vapor that hung between the rafters. This was the history of thermal stratification. The warmest air stayed at the top, rhythmically leaking through the gaps in the door to warm the humans in the longhouse. The byre was a rhythmic lung, its inhale of hay and exhale of heat, a biological promise that the mineral cold of the Greenlandic night would not breach the saturated sanctuary. The spring release, the rhythm of the weakened stumble. The cycle of the sheepfold's breath concluded with the rhythmic re-emergence of the herd. The atmosphere was one of dazzling agony. As the first grass appeared, the animals, thin and rhythmically unsteady after months of darkness, were led out. The sound was the rhythm of the hoof on rock, tock, tock, stumble. This was the sound of the survival. The vitamin depletion was the history of the seasonal minimum. The infinite loom of the byre was unspooled. The static warmth of the winter was replaced by the dynamic motion of the spring. The inhabitant, watching the cows rhythmically blink in the harsh sunlight, felt the rhythmic completion of the cycle. The biological stasis had survived the infinite loom of the ice. The only sound was the rhythmic bleat of the sheep as they found the first mineral scent of the green, a sound of life beginning to pay for the history of the warmth. The sound wave was the history of the invisible geometry. The sound would hit the granite walls of the church and reflect across the water to the distant farmsteads. This rhythmic announcement defined the limits of the parish. It was a sonic loom that bound the isolated houses into a unified body. The inhabitant, hearing the rhythmic toll, felt the mechanical security of the faith, a rhythmic anchor that held the liquid chaos of the Arctic Sea at bay. The ruins' silence, the rhythm of the static endurance. The cycle of the granite parish concluded with its final stasis. Long after the Norse left, the stones remained. The atmosphere today is one of absolute mineral peace. The sound is the rhythm of the wind in the joints. Because the granite was so rhythmically stacked with such precision, the wind cannot enter. It can only whistle over the edges. The sound is a rhythmic sigh and whistle. Sigh, whoosh. This is the last breath of Halsey. The lichen growth is the history of the slowest weave. Lichen rhythmically creeps over the granite, covering the rhythmic tool marks with a skin of grey and orange. The church is no longer a building, it is a geological feature. The infinite loom has finished its weave, leaving the static geometry of the granite to guard the rhythmic silence of the fjord. As the Arctic sun sets behind the ruins, the only sound is the rhythmic lap of the water at the base of the church, a sound of stone enduring through the infinite history of the ice. The walrus shore, the rhythmic toll of the ivory hunt. If the sheepfold's breath was the internal engine of survival, the walrus shore was the external currency of the empire. In the medieval world, Greenland was not a wasteland but a biological mint. To the courts of Europe, the walrus was the ivory of the north, and the Greenlanders were the master weavers of this white gold. To travel to the Nordsetter, the summer hunting grounds hundreds of miles north of the settlements, was to witness the rhythmic extraction of value from the sea. This was the era of the ivory trade, a movement defined by the rhythmic toll of the harpoon.
For the American reader, the walrus shore represents the industrial brutality of the frontier, a study in the scent of brine and decay and the rhythmic chipping of the cranium. The row north, the rhythm of the synchronized oar. The hunt began with a journey of expanding isolation. Men would leave the basalt respiration of their farms and row north in large open boats. The atmosphere was one of oceanic stasis. The air smelled of frigid spray, wet pine, and old seal oil. The sound was the master rhythm of the transit, the oar-lock. It was a rhythmic creak and splash. Creak, the oar hitting the leather-bound thole pin. Splash, the blade entering the grey water. This was the percussion of the distance.
The stroke count was the history of the human engine. For 18 hours a day, the men would rhythmically pull and recover. This was a mechanical hypnosis. To the rower, the world was reduced to the rhythmic back of the man in front of him. Every 1,000 strokes represented a league of progress toward the disco bay. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of distance, turning the fluid energy of the body into the static geometry of the map. The haul-out, the rhythm of the subterranean bellow. Upon reaching the hunting grounds, the Norse would encounter the haul-out, beaches where thousands of walruses lay in a static mass of flesh. The atmosphere was one of overwhelming biological presence. The air was thick with pungent musk and the steam of animal heat. The sound was the rhythm of the collective roar. The walruses would rhythmically bellow and grunt, a sound that vibrated in the basalt cliffs above. It was a rhythmic chroo, chroo, gut. This was the voice of the resource. The huddle heat was the history of the thermal pile. The animals would rhythmically shift and climb over one another to stay warm. The hunters would wait in a rhythmic silence, their breathing synchronized with the pulse of the waves. The infinite loom was gathering the ivory, a process where the rhythmic stillness of the hunter was the only way to approach the chaos of the herd. The harpoon's strike was the rhythm of the tensioned cord. The hunt itself was a ritual of mechanical physics. The atmosphere was one of sudden, violent friction. The sound was the rhythm of the whirring rope. When the harpoon was thrown, the seal hide line would rhythmically uncoil from the boat's deck. The sound was a rhythmic zing and snap. Zing, the line moving, snap, the tension as the animal dove. The toggle head was the history of the subdermal lock. Once inside the flesh, the harpoon head would rhythmically turn 90 degrees under tension, hooking into the muscle. The sound was a rhythmic thump and groan as the boat was pulled by the submerged weight. The infinite loom was binding the sea to the land, turning the fluid life of the animal into a static burden for the hunters. Every rhythmic tug on the line was a unit of wealth being hauled from the abyss. The ivory extraction was the rhythm of the chisel and bone. The real value was not the meat, but the tusks. Once the animal was brought to shore, the rhythmic processing began. The atmosphere was one of astringent calcification. The air smelled of raw ivory and cold iron. The sound was the rhythm of the precision chip. To avoid damaging the valuable ivory, the hunters would not pull the tusks, they would rhythmically chisel the bone around the socket. The sound was a rhythmic thump and groan as the boat was pulled by the submerged weight. The infinite loom was binding the sea to the land, turning the fluid life of the animal into a static burden for the hunters. Every rhythmic tug on the line was a unit of wealth being hauled from the abyss. The cargo's return was the rhythm of the rhythmic heaviness of the return journey.
The atmosphere was of exhausted satisfaction. The sound was the rhythm of the sloshen ivory. The tusks, now cleaned and tied in rhythmic bundles, were placed in the center of the boat. As the boat hit the waves, the ivory would rhythmically clatter and shift. Clatter, clatter, thud. This was the sound of the security. The boat trim was the history of the weighted horizon. The rowers now moved with a heavy rhythmic pull, their bodies leaning in to the weight of the wealth. The infinite loom of the hunt was closed. The fluid sea had been rhythmically harvested, leaving the static ivory to wait in the granite parish or the soapstone hearth for the rhythm of the merchant ship to carry it away. As the men rowed back into the basalt respiration of the settlement, the only sound was the rhythmic grumble of the ivory in the hull, a sound of value acquired to pay for the history of the cold.
The parchment's drift, the rhythmic copying of the sagas. If the walrus shore was the currency of the Greenlandic pocket, the parchment's drift was the currency of the Greenlandic mind. In the deep isolation of the Western settlement, thousands of miles from the intellectual centers of Europe, the Norse were not mere survivors, they were static archivists. To inhabit a Greenlandic longhouse during the winter was to witness the rhythmic perpetuation of the voice. This was the era of the vellum record, a movement defined by the rhythmic scratch of the quill on calfskin. For the American reader, the parchment represents the industrial slowness of information, a study in the astringent scent of oak gall ink and the rhythmic vibration of the membrane. The scraping of the skin, the rhythm of the biological canvas. A book in Greenland did not begin with an author, but with the rhythmic preparation of the surface. Because paper did not exist in the north, the inhabitants relied on vellum, processed calfskin. The atmosphere was one of damp calcification. The air smelled of chalk, dried animal protein, and sharp vinegar. The sound was the rhythm of the continuous grate. The scribe would take a dried skin and rhythmically scrape and sand it with a pumice stone or a bone file to remove the hair and oils. The sound was a rhythmic shh, 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 shh. This was the rhythm of the smoothing. The skin pore was the history of the receptive surface. By rhythmically opening the grain of the skin, the scribe ensured the ink would not bead or flake. To the Greenlander, this was a rhythmic negotiation with the dead. The infinite loom began here, in the manual transformation of the cow into the page, a process where the rhythmic stroke of the stone created a static foundation for the fluid memory. The quill's edge, the rhythm of the frictional point. Before the first letter was written, the instrument of the archive had to be tuned. In Greenland, quills were often made from the feathers of the white-tailed eagle or the goose. The atmosphere was one of surgical precision. The sound was the rhythm of the steel on feather. The scribe would take a small penknife, a rare and precious iron tool, and rhythmically whittle and shave the nib. The sound was a rhythmic snip and shave. Snip, scrape, snap. This was the tuning of the voice. The slit was the history of capillary action. A rhythmic test stroke followed, a single silent line on a scrap of vellum to ensure the ink flowed with a synchronized pulse. The scribe would rhythmically dip the point into a horn filled with ink made from crushed bark and iron filings. The sound was a rhythmic clink and suction. Clink, the horn, sigh, the ink entering the quill. The infinite loom was now threaded with liquid shadows, ready to be woven into the script. The scribe's cadence, the rhythm of the scratch, dip, scratch. Once the vellum was ruled with lead or bone lines, the real work began.
The atmosphere was one of deep, focused stasis. The air was silent except for the rhythmic respiration of the scribe by the soapstone hearth. The sound was the master rhythm of the archive, the scratch. The quill moving across the vellum produced a high-frequency vibration. It was a rhythmic zit, 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 dip, zit, zit, dip. This was the percussion of the word. Every 3 words the scribe would rhythmically return to the well. The serif was the history of the mechanical stop. Each letter of the Old Norse script was a construction project. A G or an M required 5 rhythmic movements of the hand. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of ink. To the observer, the scribe's head would rhythmically nod and sway as he tracked the exemplar text, often a worn imported saga book from Iceland. This was the geometry of the copy, a boring history of repetitive mimicry, where the great stasis of the settlement was reflected in the stasis of the line. The drying breath, the rhythm of the puff and wait. Because the ink was thick and acidic, it did not dry instantly. In the humid environment of a turf house, this was a temporal challenge. The atmosphere was one of humid suspension. The sound was the rhythm of the soft exhalation. After completing a line, the scribe would rhythmically blow across the wet ink to prevent smearing. The sound was a faint, rhythmic puff, puff. This was followed by the sand sift. The scribe would take a bowl of fine, clean beach sand and rhythmically shake and pour it over the page. The sound was a rhythmic shh, shh, shh. This was the sound of microscopic rain. This was the history of saturation. The sand would rhythmically absorb the excess, leaving the ink matte and solid. The infinite loom of the archive was a slow-motion process of addition and subtraction. The page was not written, it was accrued through these rhythmic applications of gravity and breath.
The caloric retreat, the rhythm of the dying meadow. The glacial advance hit the hayfield vigil the hardest. As the ice moved closer, the growing season rhythmically contracted. The atmosphere was one of vegetable stasis. The sound was the rhythm of the silent kill. There was no sound to a frost that came in August, only the rhythmic absence of the swish of the scythe. The boring history of the growing degree day was the history of the biological minimum. The grass rhythmically failed to seed. The infinite loom of the harvest was frayed. The rhythmic thud of the turf sled was replaced by the rhythmic scavenge for moss. To the inhabitant, the rhythmic hunger of the cows in the byre was the final metronome. Every rhythmic bellow of a starving animal was a sonic marker of the decline. The great stasis of the food supply had been rhythmically breached by the white loom of the glacier. The white silence, the rhythm of the final erasure. The cycle of the glacial advance concluded with the absolute victory of the ice. The atmosphere was one of opaque peace. The sound was the rhythm of the sifting drift. After the last family left the western settlement, the snow began to rhythmically fill the voids. The sound was a rhythmic sigh and settling. Sigh. Shh. The infinite loom of the snow was weaving a burial shroud. The ice core was the history of the archive of the white. The measured loom, the seal-bone tools, and the granite parish were rhythmically layered beneath the snow. The rhythmic pulse of the Norse was replaced by the rhythmic pulse of the seasons, the inhale of the winter and the exhale of the melt. The infinite loom has finished its weave, leaving the static geometry of the ice to guard the rhythmic silence of the north.
As the Arctic moon rises over the buried longhouse, the only sound is the rhythmic groan of the moving glacier, a sound of time consuming the stone, a final punctuation to the infinite history of the cold. The iron scrap ritual, the rhythmic sharpening of the relic. If the glacial advance was the geological force erasing the Norse, the iron scrap ritual was the mechanical resistance of the settlement. In medieval Greenland, iron was not a commodity, it was a decreasing heritage. As trade ships from Norway became rhythmic ghost alarms that never arrived, the iron already on the island had to be rhythmically recycled and resurrected. This movement explores the frictional preservation of the edge, a process defined by the repetitive erosion of the whetstone. For the American reader, the iron scrap ritual represents the extreme longevity of the tool, a study in the metallic scent of oxidation and the rhythmic vibrancy of the hone. The scavenge of the forge, the rhythm of the rusted recovery. The life of a tool in the 14th century was a history of reincarnation. A broken sword became a scythe became a knife became a needle. The atmosphere in the small turf-walled smithy was one of opaque persistence. The air smelled of charcoal smoke, old rust, and the sour tang of bog iron. The sound was the rhythm of the manual sort. The smith would move through a pile of iron remnants with a rhythmic clink and clatter, clink, scrape, thud. This was the inventory of the relic. The history of bog iron extraction was the history of the sluggish yield. Because Greenland lacked deep mines, the Norse rhythmically dug for nodules in the marshes. The sound was a rhythmic squash and squelch of the spade in the mud. The infinite loom began here, in the manual gathering of the ore, a process where the rhythmic panning of the silt provided the static atoms for the liquid fire of the forge. The bellows respiration, the rhythm of the oxygen pulse. To work the iron, the smith needed a rhythmic velocity of heat. This was the rhythm of the Leven lungs. The atmosphere was one of intense, localized radiance. The sound was the master rhythm of the smithy, the huff. The apprentice would pull the wooden handles of the bellows in a rhythmic whoosh and sigh. Whoosh, the compression, sigh, the intake. This was the respiration of the ember. The charcoal consumption was the history of the measured burn. To save precious wood, the smith rhythmically dampened the fire with water to keep the heat spatially confined. The sound was a rhythmic hiss and crackle, hiss, crackle, whoosh. The infinite loom was winding the heat, turning the static charcoal into a fluid pulse of energy that allowed the stubborn iron to softly yield to the hammer.
The hammer's geometry, the rhythm of the impact and return. Once the iron was cherry red, the smith engaged in the rhythmic thinning of the metal. The atmosphere was one of percussive weight. The sound was the rhythm of the clang and ting. The smith would strike the hot iron, followed by a lighter rhythm tap on the anvil to maintain the momentum. It was a rhythmic clang-ting, clang-ting, clang, the work, ting, the bounce. This was the sound of the shaping. The blade draw was the history of the cellular alignment. By rhythmically striking the edge, the smith was folding the impurities out of the iron. This was the percussion of the molecule. Every 100 strikes represented a micron of sharpness. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of steel, turning the brittle rust into a resilient tool. To the inhabitant, the rhythmic ring of the anvil was the acoustic proof of capability.
a boring history of kinetic perseverance that turned the static metal into a dynamic edge. The whetstone's vigil, the rhythm of the perpetual hone. Because new iron was so rare, the existing tools were rhythmically loved into thinness. This was the rhythm of the sharpening circle. The atmosphere was one of patient attrition. The sound was the rhythm of the gritty slide. Every morning, a hunter or mower would take a long oval whetstone and rhythmically rub the blade. The sound was a rhythmic sh, sh, zing, sh, sh, zing. This was the boring history of material sacrifice. By rhythmically removing a layer of steel, the user was exposing a new edge. Over decades, a broad-bladed knife would rhythmically shrink into a thin, curved sliver, a needlepoint relic of its former self. The infinite loom of the sharpening was consuming the tool to preserve the function. The sound of the stone on steel was the daily metronome of the settlement, a rhythmic reminder that the great stasis of the North required a constant erosion of the self. The final polish, the rhythmic of the oily guard. The cycle of the iron scrap ritual concluded with the rhythmic protection against the astringent damp of the fjord. The atmosphere was one of metallic sanctuary. The sound was the rhythm of the greasy rub. After sharpening, the blade was rhythmically coated in seal tallow. The sound was a rhythmic squeak and slide, squeak, slide, click. This was the boring history of oxidation delay. By rhythmically sealing the pores of the iron with fat, the inhabitant ensured the rust would not eat the tool while they slept. The result was a blade that was rhythmically thin but statically bright. The infinite loom had polished the edge. As the smithy fire died down to a rhythmic glow, the only sound was the rhythmic snap of the metal as it cooled in the rack, a utility sustained to pay for the history of the scarcity. The kelp gatherer's walk, the rhythmic scavenge of the tide. If the iron scrap ritual was the preservation of the settlement's mechanical edge, the kelp gatherer's walk was the biological scavenge for its very life. As the glacial advance choked the hay fields and the sheep's foal's breath grew faint with hunger, the Norse were forced to turn their backs on the frozen land and face the rhythmic reciprocity of the Atlantic. This movement explores the manual monotony of the tide line, a process defined by the rhythmic bending and lifting of the wet. For the American reader, the kelp gatherer represents the absolute threshold of survival, a study in the briny scent of rotting wrack and the rhythmic squelch of the mud. The tidal clock, the rhythm of the receding boundary. The scavenge began with the atmospheric grey of the low tide. In Greenland, the sea was the only unfrozen clock. The atmosphere was one of brackish anticipation. The air smelled of iodine, cold salt, and decomposing crustaceans. The sound was the master rhythm of the shore, the lap and sigh. As the water retreated, it revealed the marine sward, the massive forests of kelp and dulse clinging to the rocks. It was a rhythmic slosh and gurgle. Slosh, the wave; gurgle, the water draining through the stones. This was the percussion of the opportunity. The intertwinal zone was the history of the temporary field. The gatherer had only a 4-hour window of rhythmic access before the infinite loom of the moon brought the water back. To the Greenlander, this was a rhythmic race against the gravity. The infinite loom began here, in the manual observation of the water level, a process where the rhythmic retreat of the sea provided the static mineral for the starving body. The bending arc, the rhythm of the back and basket. To harvest the kelp, the gatherer engaged in the rhythmic mechanical bow. The atmosphere was one of saturated weight.
The sound was the rhythm of the wet tear. The gatherer would grasp the slippery fronds of the laminaria and rhythmically pull and slice them from the basalt. The sound was a rhythmic rip and plop. Rip, the suction breaking. Plop, the seaweed hitting the wicker basket. This was the sound of the accumulation. The boring history of the dorsal strain was the history of the human lever. Every 30 seconds, the gatherer would rhythmically straighten and heave the growing weight onto their shoulders. This was a rhythmic measure of caloric debt. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of survival, turning the fluid vegetation of the abyss into a static pile of emergency fodder. To the inhabitant, the rhythmic squelch of their boots in the mud was the acoustic proof of effort, a boring history of viscous resistance that turned the useless shore into a luminous larder. The brine wash, the rhythm of the desalination scrub. Kelp could not be eaten or fed to sheep immediately. The salt content was a mineral poison in high doses. This was the rhythm of the frictional rinse. The atmosphere was one of cold, numbing humidity. The sound was the rhythm of the splash and rub. Near a freshwater stream flowing from the glacier, the gatherer would rhythmically dunk and shake the piles of kelp. The sound was a rhythmic swish, swish, thump. Swish, the water; thump, the kelp hitting the drying stone. This was the boring history of solute removal. By rhythmically agitating the fiber, the gatherer washed away the excess salt. This was the percussion of the purity. Every 1,000 splashes represented a step toward digestibility. The infinite loom was refining the scavenge, turning the astringent seaweed into a nutritious supplement, a rhythmic transformation that allowed the sheepfold's breath to continue for another week. The drying rack, the rhythm of the salt crust crackle. Once washed, the kelp was rhythmically draped. This was the rhythm of the leathern hang. The atmosphere was one of rubbery dehydration. The sound was the rhythm of the stiffening snap. As the wind passed through the hanging kelp, it would rhythmically dry and harden. The sound was a rhythmic rattle and click. Rattle, the wind; click, the hardened fronds hitting one another. This was the boring history of preservation by air. The gatherer would rhythmically turn the fronds to ensure the sun, if it appeared, reached every pore. The infinite loom of the drying was consolidating the mineral, turning the heavy, wet weight into a light, brittle archive of calories. The sound of the kelp in the wind was the coastal metronome, a rhythmic reminder that the great stasis of the settlement was now tethered to the tide. The final stew, the rhythm of the gelatinous simmer. The cycle of the kelp gatherer's walk concluded with the rhythmic consumption by the hearth. The atmosphere was one of aqueous desperation. The sound was the rhythm of the bubble and slurp. In the soapstone pot, the dried kelp was rhythmically rehydrated and boiled with scraps of seal fat. The sound was a rhythmic glug and sizzle. Glug, the thickening stew; sizzle, the fat melting. This was the boring history of gastric survival. By rhythmically stirring the pot with a bone spoon, the inhabitant ensured the mineral heat was evenly distributed. The result was a meal that was rhythmically salty but statically life-sustaining. The infinite loom had closed the gap between the empty field and the full belly. As the hearth fire died, the only sound was the rhythmic squelch of the damp kelp in the storage corner, a sound of time bought to pay for the history of the hunger. The latches of the dark, the rhythmic sealing of the door. If the kelp gatherer's walk was the final search for sustenance, the latches of the dark represented the final structural withdrawal. By the late 14th century, the settlements had begun to contract, not just geographically, but architecturally. As the external world became a mineral void of ice and wind, the Norse family engaged in a boring history of atmospheric sealing.
This movement explores the rhythmic blockage of the voids, a process defined by the thud of the turf against the entrance. For the American reader, the latching represents the geometry of the burrow, a study in the scent of recycled oxygen and the rhythmic muffle of the dead bolt. The threshold's retreat, the rhythm of the void filling. The sealing began as the glacial advance brought the first black blizzard of the season. In Greenland, a door was not a portal for social entry, but a weakness in the bastion. The atmosphere was one of claustrophobic preservation. The air smelled of damp sod, stored fat, and frozen wool.
The sound was the rhythm of the packing thud. To prevent the thermal leaking of the precious hearth heat, the inhabitants would rhythmically stuff the gaps around the driftwood doorframe with moss and scrap wadmal. The sound was a rhythmic punch and poke, thud, poke, sigh. This was the percussion of the insulation. The secondary turf wall was the history of the blocked path. In the hardest winters, the main door was not just closed, it was rhythmically buried from the inside with fresh slabs of turf. The sound was a rhythmic slap and pack, slap, slap, thud. This was the sound of the world vanishing. The infinite loom began here, in the manual deletion of the exterior, a process where the rhythmic application of earth turned the fragile home into a static subterranean chamber. The bone bolt, the rhythm of the frictional lock. Once the gaps were stuffed, the primary mechanical guard was the latch. In a land without iron hinges, the Norse relied on biological fasteners. The atmosphere was one of internal tension. The sound was the master rhythm of the enclosure, the slide. The bolt, carved from a heavy walrus rib or a piece of whalebone, would rhythmically grind across the wood to find its socket. The sound was a rhythmic scrape and thump. Scrape the bone on wood, thump the seat. This was the sound of the finality. The socket wear was the history of the repeated security. Over generations, the rhythmic sliding of the bone would wear a smooth, polished path into the driftwood frame. This was the geometry of the habit. To the inhabitant, the rhythmic click of the latch was the acoustic proof of separation. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of privacy, turning the fluid fear of the storm into the static comfort of the locked room. For the American reader, imagine a world where the sound of a bolt is the only thing standing between respiration and the absolute zero of the Arctic night. The air's stagnation, the rhythm of the heavy breath. With the latches latched and the turf packed, the basaltic respiration of the house changed. The atmosphere was one of biological saturation. The air became heavy and oily, thick with the carbon dioxide pulse of the huddle. The sound was the rhythm of the collective inhale. Because the house was rhythmically sealed, the sound of human breathing became magnified. It was a rhythmic hiss and pause. Hiss, the indraft; pause, the oxygen exchange. This was the boring history of oxygen conservation. By rhythmically damping the blubber lamp, the family ensured they did not consume the air too quickly. The sound was a rhythmic snuff and smoke. Each rhythmic hiss of a wick was a temporal unit of survival. The infinite loom was thickening the atmosphere, turning the empty space of the room into a solid mass of shared heat, a rhythmic transformation that allowed the sheepfold's breath and the human pulse to become a single biological unit. The drift's weight, the rhythm of the overhead compression. Outside, the snow did not just fall, it rhythmically accumulated. This was the rhythm of the crystalline press. The atmosphere was one of vertical gravity. The sound was a rhythmic groan and settling, As the snow rose above the height of the latched door, the structural load on the turf walls and driftwood rafters would rhythmically increase. The sound was a rhythmic cree-yeek snap. Cree-yeek, the wood bending, snap, the ice outside shifting. This was the boring history of volumetric burial. The infinite loom of the snow was sealing the roof, turning the turf mound into a white dome. The inhabitant, sitting beneath the rhythmic stress of the rafters, felt the mechanical power of the winter. The sound of the wind over the vent was a rhythmic whistle and drop. Whistle, the peak, drop, the vacuum. This was the sonic measurement of the isolation, a rhythmic reminder that the great stasis was now absolute. The candle's end, the rhythm of the nocturnal pulse. The cycle of the latches of the dark concluded with the rhythmic acceptance of the shadow. The atmosphere was of absolute mineral stillness. The sound was the rhythm of the faint heartbeat. In the absolute black of the latched house, the only remaining rhythm was the pulse of the inhabitants. The sound was a rhythmic thump, thump, dot, dot, thump, thump. This was the final respiration of the settlement.
The sound was the rhythm of the packing thud. To prevent the thermal leaking of the precious hearth heat, the inhabitants would rhythmically stuff the gaps around the driftwood doorframe with moss and scrap wadmal. The sound was a rhythmic punch and poke, thud, poke, sigh. This was the percussion of the insulation. The secondary turf wall was the history of the blocked path. In the hardest winters, the main door was not just closed, it was rhythmically buried from the inside with fresh slabs of turf. The sound was a rhythmic slap and pack, slap, slap, thud. This was the sound of the world vanishing. The infinite loom began here, in the manual deletion of the exterior, a process where the rhythmic application of earth turned the fragile home into a static subterranean chamber. The bone bolt, the rhythm of the frictional lock. Once the gaps were stuffed, the primary mechanical guard was the latch. In a land without iron hinges, the Norse relied on biological fasteners. The atmosphere was one of internal tension. The sound was the master rhythm of the enclosure, the slide. The bolt, carved from a heavy walrus rib or a piece of whalebone, would rhythmically grind across the wood to find its socket. The sound was a rhythmic scrape and thump. Scrape, the bone on wood, thump, the seat. This was the sound of the finality. The socket wear was the history of the repeated security. Over generations, the rhythmic sliding of the bone would wear a smooth, polished path into the driftwood frame. This was the geometry of the habit. To the inhabitant, the rhythmic click of the latch was the acoustic proof of separation. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of privacy, turning the fluid fear of the storm into the static comfort of the locked room. For the American reader, imagine a world where the sound of a bolt is the only thing standing between respiration and the absolute zero of the Arctic night. The air's stagnation, the rhythm of the heavy breath. With the door latched and the turf packed, the basalt respiration of the house changed. The atmosphere was one of biological saturation. The air became heavy and oily, thick with the carbon dioxide pulse of the huddle. The sound was the rhythm of the collective inhale. Because the house was rhythmically sealed, the sound of human breathing became magnified. It was a rhythmic hiss and pause. Hiss, the indraft. Pause, the oxygen exchange. This was the boring history of oxygen conservation. By rhythmically damping the blubber lamp, the family ensured they did not consume the air too quickly. The sound was a rhythmic snuff and smoke. Each rhythmic hiss of a wick snuffed was a temporal unit of survival.
The infinite loom was thickening the atmosphere, turning the empty space of the room into a solid mass of shared heat, a rhythmic transformation that allowed the sheepfold's breath and the human pulse to become a single biological unit. The drift's weight, the rhythm of the overhead compression. Outside, the snow did not just fall, it rhythmically accumulated. This was the rhythm of the crystalline press. The atmosphere was one of vertical gravity. The sound was a rhythmic groan and settling. As the snow rose above the height of the latched door, the structural load on the turf walls and driftwood rafters would rhythmically increase. The sound was a rhythmic creak, snap, creak, the wood bending, snap, the ice outside shifting. This was the boring history of volumetric burial. The infinite loom of the snow was sealing the roof, turning the turf mound into a white dome. The inhabitant, sitting beneath the rhythmic stress of the rafters, felt the mechanical power of the winter. The sound of the wind over the vent was a rhythmic whistle and drop, whistle the peak, drop the vacuum. This was the sonic measurement of the isolation, a rhythmic reminder that the great stasis was now absolute. The candle's end, the rhythm of the nocturnal pulse, the cycle of the latches of the dark concluded with the rhythmic acceptance of the shadow. The atmosphere was one of absolute mineral stillness. The sound was the rhythm of the faint heartbeat. In the absolute black of the latched house, the only remaining rhythm was the pulse of the inhabitants. The sound was a rhythmic thump-thump, thump-thump. This was the final respiration of the settlement.
The extended sleep was the history of the metabolic slowdown. The infinite loom had closed the weave. The door was latched, the turf was packed, and the measured loom was silent. The inhabitant, wrapped in rhythmic layers of wadmal, drifted into a static dream of Norway. The only sound was the rhythmic scratch of the wind against the outer latch, a sound of nature trying to enter the history of the burrow and finding only the static resistance of the stone. The missing ship, the rhythmic scanning of the empty fjord. If the latches of the dark represented the final structural withdrawal into the earth, the missing ship represented the final psychological severance. By the early 15th century, the Greenlanders had transitioned from being the far-flung sons of Norway to being the abandoned residue of the North. The infinite loom of Atlantic trade, which once brought iron, grain, and news, had rhythmically unraveled. This movement explores the manual desperation of the horizon watch, a process defined by the rhythmic pacing of the high cliffs. For the American reader, the missing ship represents the existential dread of the disconnected, a study in the scent of brine mist and the rhythmic squint of the eye. The lookout's vigil, the rhythm of the optical sweep. The watch began in the atmospheric clarity of the spring thaw. In the early centuries, the arrival of the Nar, the merchant ship, was a rhythmic certainty. By 1410, the date of the last recorded ship to leave Greenland, it became a rhythmic hope. The atmosphere was one of sustained optical strain. The air smelled of melting bergs, salt spray, and cold, thin oxygen. The sound was the rhythm of the gravel step. A lookout would climb to the highest Bulsalt Ridge overlooking the eastern settlement's mouth and rhythmically pace the perimeter. The sound was a rhythmic crunch and pause. Crunch, crunch, the boots on the scree. Pause, the scan of the horizon. This was the percussion of the expectation. The refraction era was the history of the false sail. In the cold, stratified air, mirages, fata morgana, would rhythmically distort the icebergs on the horizon, making them appear like the square sails of a Norwegian ship. To the Greenlander, this was a rhythmic cruelty of light. The infinite loom began here, in the manual observation of the void, a process where the rhythmic movement of the eyes attempted to weave a vessel out of the empty blue. The signal can, the rhythm of the luminous beacon. To guide the ship that never came, the Norse maintained a network of signal cairns. This was the rhythm of the stone-on-stone stack. The atmosphere was one of structural desperation. The sound was the rhythm of the clink and thud. A lookout would rhythmically rebuild the cairn after the winter storms had toppled the top stones. The sound was a rhythmic clink, clunk, scrape. Clink, the granite hitting granite. Clunk, the seat. Scrape, the alignment. This was the sound of the landmark. The visibility range was the history of the geometric signal. By rhythmically increasing the height of the stone pile, the Norse were extending their reach into the Atlantic. This was the percussion of the silhouette. Every stone added was a rhythmic unit of hope. The infinite loom was weaving a fabric of guidance, turning the static rock of the cliff into a dynamic message of presence. To the inhabitant, the rhythmic profile of the cairn against the sky was the acoustic proof of identity, a boring history of mineral stasis that told the empty sea, "We are still here." The harbor's silence, the rhythm of the lapping absence. Down in the harbor, near the granite parish of Walsey, the rhythmic activity of the pier had ceased. The atmosphere was one of industrial decay. The air was still and quiet, thick with the rhythmic slosh of water against rotting wood. The sound was the rhythm of the idle tie ring. An iron ring bolted into a granite slab from mooring would rhythmically clink in the wind, having no rope to hold. It was a rhythmic clink, clink, clink. This was the history of unused capacity. By rhythmically watching the tide come in and out without a hull to lift, the Norse witnessed the decline of the colony. The sound was a rhythmic slap and drain. Slap, the water hitting the pier, drain, the retreat through the stones. This was the sound of the disconnection. The infinite loom was unweaving the trade, turning the fluid hub of the empire into a static backwater of the void, a rhythmic transformation that left the walrus ivory and the wadmal bolts to stagnate in the warehouse. The memory loom, the rhythm of the recited list. In the absence of new information, the internal narrative of the settlement became rhythmically repetitive. The atmosphere was one of narrative stagnation. The sound was the rhythm of the saga recitation. In the soapstone hearth, the family would rhythmically recite the lineage of the kings and bishops of Norway. The sound was a rhythmic hum and chant. Hum, the voice; chant, the name. This was the boring history of cultural preservation. By rhythmically listing the missing, the Norse were maintaining the connection in their minds. The sound of the old names was the social metronome, a rhythmic reminder that they were part of a greater history, even as the physical history of the ships rhythmically failed. The infinite loom of the memory was tightening the weave, turning the fluid identity of the colonist into the static identity of the ghost. The final horizon, the rhythmic of the sinking hope. The cycle of the missing ship concluded with the rhythmic acceptance of the end. The atmosphere was one of total oceanic indifference. The sound was the rhythm of the breaking wave. One autumn, the lookout would rhythmically descend the ridge for the last time, knowing the ice pack was closing the fjord for the winter. The sound was a rhythmic slide and crunch. Slide, the descent; crunch, the finality. This was the death of the expectation. The history of the abandoned vigil was the history of the silent shore. The infinite loom of the Atlantic was closed. The rhythmic pulse of the merchant was gone. The inhabitant, looking out one last time over the static grey water, felt the rhythmic loneliness of the settlement, a biological realization that they were the final punctuation of the Norse expansion. The only sound was the rhythmic lap of the water against the signal cairn, a sound of time forgetting the name, a final closure to the infinite history of the forgotten. The final bone, the rhythmic extinction of the last farmstead. If the missing ship was the psychological severance of the colony, the final bone was the biological full stop. In the mid to late 15th century, the pulse of the Norse in Greenland did not cease with a grand battle or a dramatic fire. It faded through a boring history of nutritional contraction. As the infinite loom of the climate tightened, the last farmsteads, perhaps at Herjulfsnæs or Sandnes, witnessed the rhythmic deconstruction of the domestic unit. This movement explores the osteological archive of the end, a process defined by the rhythmic scrape of the teeth against the marrow. For the American reader, the final bone represents the absolute limit of the organism, a study in the scent of ancient dust and the rhythmic stillness of the permafrost. The inventory of the desperate, the rhythm of the skeletal scavenge. The end began in the atmospheric gloom of a final winter byre. With the hayfield vigil long dead, the livestock were no longer a source of milk or future wealth, they were a static reserve of calories. The atmosphere was one of skeletal industry. The air smelled of old hide, cold ash, and frozen starvation. The sound was the rhythm of the bone split. In the dim light of a failing soapstone hearth, an inhabitant would take the last iron knife or a heavy stone and rhythmically strike the long bones of a slaughtered cow or dog. The sound was a rhythmic crack and splinter. Crack, the impact; splinter, the access to the marrow. This was the percussion of the last resource. The boring history of marrow extraction was the history of the final calorie. By rhythmically boiling the bone fragments, the Norse extracted every microscopic unit of fat. To the Greenlander, this was a rhythmic negotiation with death. The infinite loom began here, in the manual deconstruction of the herd, a process where the rhythmic scrape of the spoon attempted to buy a day from the empty horizon.
The subsidence of the herd, the rhythm of the empty stall. As the animals died, the sheepfold's breath vanished, and the byre became a mineral void. This was the rhythm of the thermal collapse. The atmosphere was one of crystalline silence. The sound was the rhythm of the single breath. Where once 20 cows produced a collective hum, now only one remained, its breathing a rhythmic hiss and shudder. Hiss, shudder. This was the sound of the shrinking engine. The biological depletion was the history of the cold wall. Without the animal heat, the basalt respiration of the turf walls could not hold. The frost rhythmically crept inward from the corners. The sound was a rhythmic snap and tinkle as moisture on the walls froze into needles. Snap, tinkle, drop. The infinite loom was unmaking the sanctuary, turning the living byre into a frozen vault, a rhythmic transformation that left the static stone to reclaim the fluid life. The scavenged wadmal was the rhythm of the threadbare huddle. Without new wool from the measured loom, the clothing of the last Norse became a rhythmic patchwork. This was the rhythm of the frictional wear. The atmosphere was one of fibrous fragility. The sound was the rhythm of the soft tear. A woman would take a needle and rhythmically darn the holes in a tunic that had already seen 3 generations of wear. The sound was a rhythmic zip and pull. Zip, the bone needle through the wool; pull, the thread tightening. This was the boring history of material exhaustion. By rhythmically layering the rags, the inhabitants created a thermal barrier of desperation. The infinite loom of the clothing was fraying. Every rhythmic stitch was a measurement of the scarcity. To the observer, the rhythmic movement of the needle was the final metronome of the household, a boring history of manual persistence that turned the static fabric into a living shroud. The archaeological layer was the rhythm of the sifting silt. This was the rhythm of the downward drift. The atmosphere was one of sedimentary finality. The sound was the rhythm of the falling turf. As the last inhabitant died or left, the basalt respiration of the roof rhythmically failed. The weight of the glacial advance and the rhythmic snow pushed the roof into the room. The sound was a rhythmic thud and settle. Thud, the rafter breaking; settle, the earth filling the void. This was the boring history of stratigraphy. The infinite loom of the earth was archiving the settlement.
The seal-bone tools, the missing ship's signal cairns, and the final bone were rhythmically encapsulated in the permafrost. This was the percussion of the millennia. Every rhythmic freeze and thaw of the soil compressed the archive, turning the fluid history of the Norse into a static layer of debris. The quiet extinction was the rhythm of the frozen horizon, the cycle of the final bone, and the entire infinite loom of Greenland concluded with the rhythmic return to the mineral. The atmosphere today is one of infinite, indifferent light. The sound is the rhythm of the wind over the mounds. At the site of the last farm, the wind rhythmically scours the turf, revealing a white sliver of bone or a fragment of a soapstone pot. The sound is a rhythmic hiss and whistle. Hiss, whoosh. This is the last word of the North. The extinction was the history of the silent loom, the rhythmic pulse of the Norse. The weaving, the haying, the hunting, the praying is stopped. The infinite loom has finished its weave. The static geometry of the ice and the mineral stasis of the granite have won. The inhabitant is gone, but the rhythmic vibration of the fjord remains, a biological ghost in a geological reality. As the Arctic sun makes its rhythmic circle in the sky, the only sound is the rhythmic lap of the cold water against the final bone, a sound of nature reclaiming the waste, a final closure to the infinite history of the cold.
That is where the true spirit of medieval Greenland, years of ice, sheep, and stone rests. And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share, where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright, and your heart filled with gratitude. And I pray for your success and abundance. Good night.